So now that we understand a little bit more about looping through an array and using some conditions, it's time to actually implement that on our other code. I'm going to copy or comment that out, and I'll actually just copy this because I'm not going to use the whole thing. We'll uncomment this and just really just use the description here. So let's get rid of everything else. And again, I made a copy so I'd have some of these things inside of the code itself so you can take a look at it. But now here we've got our description here. And this could be read as description items. Because really, since it's a class, it gets all of the elements of that class. Even if there's only one of them, it still gets all of them. And it turns it into an array. That's why when we did console log the length of this, it actually gave us a number like 0, 1, 2, or so on. Right? It's actually counting the number of items in that array. So that also means that we can come in here and do .each, the description items, function, index, the object, and then run through a few things here. So what I'm going to do is actually console log index and obj, and we'll take a look at that. This might be what you do intuitively. I'm like, hey, I want to do it here, and I'm going to want to run some things on here. I want to run some conditions on these items in this description. So I go back in Chrome, I refresh, and what do I see? I actually see HTML itself. I don't see anything that looks to be related to jQuery. In other words, if I try to do object.height like that, much like we did up here, what happens? Well, I get an error saying height is not a function at HTML paragraph element. Well, what's happening here is we're looping through the actual HTML elements themselves. So this object is an HTML element. That's the HTML. But the jQuery element is stored in something called this. So basically we'll say var each item is this, and then their counterparts, so the index and the object or the HTML itself is in here. I know this is a little confusing, but basically just remember that if you're iterating through after you did a selector, there's a really good chance that you'll have to use this. So now I can do console log index and each item dot height, and we can see what that is. Oops, console not oog but log. And now we see that, hey, first element and second element, we've got 300 and 300. This other one is length. We'll leave that out. Okay, so that's the height it's supposed to be. But what's the height that it actually is? So for this, we have to take a closer look on what this is. So let's do console log. And I'm going to change this from each item to just being item. And we'll console log and take a look at that, what this actually represents. So we'll refresh, and we see that it says P description. And we've got all sorts of things in here. P description is the selector. That's the actual item selector. And if we look in here, I have all different like attributes and values that I can actually see. I can see something called inner HTML. I can scroll down and say offset height, top, width, so on. There's a lot of numbers in here that you might end up playing around with. One of the big ones is scroll height. Well, what's the scroll height related to? Let's actually take a look at that. But what I want to do is roll all the way back up and see that these are in brackets. What does that mean? That means that it actually is its own array. So to find out what the height is, we have to use the 0th element or the first element in that array and do scroll height. Save that, refresh, and now we have two different scroll heights. One makes sense, 300. The other also makes sense, it's really, really big. So now what I want to say is, okay, I've got this scroll height. So any item any item, not object, but any item that I want to, that is bigger than the scroll height, any item that's bigger than the scroll height, I want to add that overflow scroll. So how do we do that? Well, let's go ahead and say var, I'll call it actual height is equal to this. And then I'll say var should be height. And that is equal to item.height. Okay. So now let's go ahead and console log those. Actual height should be height. Refresh. And there we go. So we've got two differences here. Okay. Now all I'm going to do is if actual height is greater than should be height, then the item, we want to CSS overflow y scroll. Or you could also just do overflow scroll, but I'm going to do overflow y scroll. We save that, refresh. Let's close this out. What do we got here? We have two paragraphs now, and this is actually a scrolling paragraph. Really cool. So that is how you would go about doing something like that. And the other nice thing about this is that, hey, well, these overflow scroll, yeah, sure, I could have put that CSS on here, but what if I wanted to only do it, maybe not if it's exactly over it, but what if I wanted to say actual height, like plus, or should be height plus like, I don't know, 50. Like, oh, I'm going to give it a buffer of 50. If it's a little bit bigger than the other ones, sure, I'll give them that buffer and then refresh in here. And this is now going to be just a little bit bigger than it was. It's not going to be bigger than it was, but it can allow for bigger content than that to come in. So that means that if the height was only 50, then it would do that. So like if I change this to a much bigger number, it's not going to do the scroll unless it's actually bigger than that one. In this case, it definitely is still bigger, which is why the scroll is still showing up, and it's showing up inside of this element itself. So you could do all sorts of things with these items. And I could add in something like padding, 30 pixels and 10 pixels. That changes the element a little bit too. Gives us some padding up here and then some padding on the side, and so on. So that is all we're going to do with that one. What we still have to understand is how do we actually select one specific element? Stay with us.